The next speaker was Catherine Bonishow, assistant professor in early Judaism in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, 2018 PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in Classical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies, author of a string of articles on the reception of Roman institutions and the Greco-Roman past in ancient Jewish texts, and a parallel string of articles on Palmyrene epigraphy, with a special concern for what, in my opinion, is the knotty historical problem of the bilingualism of the inscriptions. Kate is on the verge of completing her first monograph on Greek and Roman festivals in the ancient Jewish imagination, and she will be speaking right now on invisible, unless the title is changed, invisible Aramaic documents and the Achaemenid Empire. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am very excited to be here, and I'm very grateful for the organizers of the conference. My colleague, of course, Rahim Shaigan, who's been a wonderful support in my extending into the Achaemenid studies as best I can, as someone really primarily trained in Hebrew Bible and Aramaic of the Greek and Roman periods. I'd also like to thank John Ma and Mark Vandenmeyer, as well as the administrative staff that have made it possible for all of us to be here. So I'm excited to share my work today, and also excited to be on a panel with Dr. Holm. It's a delight to meet you in person. And in the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridates, and Tabael, and the rest of their associates, wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia, the document, nishtewan, was written in Aramaic and read in Aramaic, with Aramaic adverbial form Aramis. A single verse of the book of Ezra twice emphasizes the prominence of Aramaic, both documentary and orally, in the Achaemenid Empire. Documents like letters and contracts found throughout the ancient Near East, including Elephantine in Egypt, Bactria, Samaria, and Persepolis, among others, show that this association is not a mere literary motif. Rather, a distinctive and relatively consistent form of Aramaic was used throughout the provinces as an administrative lingua franca, first described by Joseph Marquardt as Reich Aramaic, and more recently termed Imperial Aramaic or Achaemenid Official Aramaic by Hubert Gazella. The Achaemenid context of these Aramaic documentary or literary texts is largely visible. Recent scholarship has importantly focused on questions of the role of Aramaic in knowledge transmission, beginning in the 7th century or even earlier to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. Essentially, on questions of how and why did Aramaic come to be such a cosmopolitan language in the ancient Near East, providing avenues for the intersections of Mesopotamian scientific and cosmological knowledge into the Dead Sea Scrolls and other biblical texts, as well as other documents. Essentially, they ask, why are texts from Babylon, Elephantine, and parts of the Hebrew Bible, among others, written in Aramaic? Relying on the work of Mario Fales, Stephen Kaufman, Matthew Nujar, and my co-panelist today, Tawny Holm, Seth Sanders argued convincingly in his 2018 book, From Adapa to Enoch, that Aramaic's incorporation into the scribal communities of the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, as well as the separation of the utility of the Aramaic language from its distinctive Aramean background, created, quote, relative neutrality, even invisibility, which made Aramaic scholarship such a powerful medium, pervasive in the training of writers all over the ancient Near East by the 5th century BCE. Aramaic was a scribal culture whose power resided precisely in the fact that it did not seem like a culture at all. Essentially, Aramaic's invisibility meant it could be any group's or any empire's language or tradition, truly cosmopolitan. As Dr. Holm just spoke on, an Aramaic story need not be about an Aramean, or a Persian, or even an Assyrian. And in the last 5 years or so, scholars like Annette Reed and Matthew Goff have sparked renewed interest in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, a fragment of which is found here. I think it's 4Q209, and have similarly found in specifically Hellenistic contexts the role of Aramaic as a cosmopolitan, almost universal language of knowledge transmission between Mesopotamia and Judea. The scholarly work that I have only briefly described has made it an exciting time, to be quite honest, to be a scholar of Aramaic studies, especially as we think about the intersections, not just of peoples, but also of traditions in the ancient Near East, as well as Aramaic's almost reversal from a universal language in the Roman period to be a language of multiple so-called national dialects and scripts. While I agree with Sanders and others' underlying thesis that Aramaic functions as a cosmopolitan language because of its invisible scribal culture, today I'd like to continue my work on the materiality of Aramaic texts. Thus, instead of asking why texts are, say, written in Aramaic, today I will hope to investigate the actual visibility of Aramaic or other documents in literary texts of the Achaemenid and early Hellenistic periods. These will include the texts of Ahiqar and the Behistun papyrus, as well as some of the imperial court tales found in the Hebrew Bible, which I hope to get to at the end. The documents of the Achaemenid Aramaic corpus abound, but they are more often than not just that. Documentary texts, letters, orders, laws, contracts, receipts. These make up the majority of Aramaic texts from this period, with very few examples of literary texts, and those that we actually do have that are not in the Hebrew Bible are really quite fragmentary and often, as we just saw in Dr. Holmes' lecture, sometimes very difficult to analyze. In spite of these difficulties, I will ask today how and where Aramaic texts are visible or invisible in the literature of the Achaemenid and Hellenistic periods, and how these visions or material visions reflect the varied approaches, assumptions, and memories of Achaemenid bureaucracy and power. Documentation and writing were foundational to the Achaemenid Empire. Indeed, as Kurt writes, the king's word, communicated in whatever form to all, was the effective glue that held the empire together. I'll begin with a brief overview of different terms for or types of Aramaic or other documentary texts within the corpus of Achaemenid official Aramaic. And this review I'm imagining as a sort of positive control for my investigation of documentary imagery. It's not meant to be all-inclusive of text types, but I hope to show that there are particular text types that we can actually see in the Aramaic documentary corpora of Elephantine and elsewhere in the Achaemenid world. So in order to best orient my inquiry into references to actual documents in Aramaic literature, I'll be looking at, again, formulaic conventions and this terminology using these three prominent resources, although additional texts as well when necessary. So I'll be including documents from Porton and Yardani's textbook of Aramaic documents from ancient Egypt, the unprovenance texts from Naveh and Shakhead's Aramaic documents from ancient Bactria of the Khalili collections, and then also Jan Dushek's collation of the Aramaic legal documents from Samaria. Most of the texts I'll talk about today, other than the biblical texts, will come and will range in date from about the mid-5th century to just after Alexander's defeat of Darius III, looking at some of the Bactria corpus. Okay. Among the Aramaic parchments, papyri, ostraca, and other inscriptions, one of the most frequent terms used for physical documents is, unsurprisingly, sephar, often translated as scroll or document generally. It's used in Old Aramaic and in other cognate languages, and among the Achaemenid corpus, it can generally indicate any type of document, but it most often occurs from my searches in contracts or other legal texts to refer to the actual documents of a contract. So it's used, for example, in the Mibtahaya archive of TAD B. Now, one of the more noticeable features of the Achaemenid Aramaic corpus is not just its use of Sephar, but its actual more particular technical terminology for document types or subtypes of documents. So the iggrah, which I have here in Latin transliteration, is an epistolary form or a letter sent across the empire to and from officials of all levels. TAD A4.7, the first draft of the request for a letter of recommendation to rebuild the temple from the Yehud archive, includes multiple references to an iggrah, sent or some not actually sent, to and from governors, military officials, and temple priests. Just to go through the multiple times an iggrah is listed, in line 7 of the document, the wicked figure Vidranga sends an iggrah to his son Nephinah, head of the garrison at Syene, with instructions to demolish the temple to Yahweh in the fortress of Elephantine. Later, in line 18, Yedaniah and his colleagues speak of their own iggrah that they send to Begohi, the governor of Yehud, and the high priest Yehochanan in Jerusalem, complaining that they never actually received an iggrah in return, which is one of my favorite. You can return my voicemail messages of the Elephantine corpus. In line 29, Yedaniah and his colleagues similarly describe the iggrah they sent to the sons of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. Just like the iggrah or letter permeates TADA 4.7, so too does it permeate the Aramaic corpus. It's one of the most common terms used throughout. Another common documentary term found is te'em. So it's tet ein mem, often translated as order or decree. James Moore has recently suggested that te'em is best understood as an actual subgenre of the iggrah letter form, with a specific judicial or otherwise administrative function. In his analysis, it is something ordered by someone higher up in the hierarchy. For example, one of the documents from the Arshama archive, TAD A6.3, a satrap sets or determines te'em. As with many Achaemenid document types, this te'em originating in Egypt looks much like those originating in Bactria in terms of their format and application. As Moore argues, the phrase set a decree, sam te'em, in Aramaic, refers to the administrative writing of a uniquely formatted document that was taught and practiced throughout the imperial administration for almost 200 years, end quote. The physical document itself seems to act as an important part of a decree's authorization and dissemination, evident in references to the physical document and some form of the C-stem verb meaning to carry, evident in TADA 2.9, as well as the Bactria documents A4 and A8. Other terms for documents found in the Achaemenid corpus are Old Persian loanwords, including nishtewan, meaning ordinance or document, and pitgam, meaning word or command, and sometimes used in parallel to aim, such as in the Bactria document A1, line 4, where it's before the pitgam was issued to him, an order to aim was given to him, so they're used in parallel. Now, there are, of course, other ways to describe or refer to physical documents, but I include the albeit brief list of some of the more common terms to highlight the roles that physical and specific types of documents with particular uses held throughout the Aramaic corpus. Scholars have long noted the consistent linguistic features of imperial or Achaemenid official Aramaic across wide geographical areas. so too are references to physical documents, their conventions, and overall utility in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. As Lisbeth Fried notes, quote, even though these documents are from Bactria, at the extreme other end of the empire, their epistolary style is identical to that utilized in the Aramaic documents from Egypt. The Achaemenid propensity for letters and other documentary forms is sometimes visible and actively noted by Greek contemporaries like Herodotus and Thucydides in what Lindsay Allen called in a 2013 article, epistolary memories. For example, Thucydides briefly describes the physical or material letters of a captured Persian messenger. They are written in, I have it up here, Assyrian grammaton, most likely, in my view, a reference to Aramaic language or script, not Akkadian. However, some Greek epistolary memories are actually not so much epistolary in Allen's findings. In her view, analysis of Herodotus's, some of Herodotus's stories, the physical documents of the Achaemenids only would come into focus in episodes concerning transitions of royal or state power, as though their physical weight became more important on these occasions. And often when Herodotus seems to talk about these actual documents, he is using them to critique Persia and long-distance communication throughout the empire. Now, despite the ubiquity of Aramaic documents in the Achaemenid Empire, and the Achaemenid period, literary texts are simply few and far between. And even when we do find them, as I've already said, they're really fragmentary, making them very difficult to fully understand their development, source history, and overall content. But despite these difficulties, I will examine these literary texts for references to imagined or actual documents or pronouncements. While Aramaic or other Achaemenid documents are visible in ancient Jewish, particularly biblical stories, as well as Greek tales like Thucydides and Herodotus, what I will show today is that these same documents are actually mostly absent from literary texts of the Achaemenid period. Now, most of my analysis will focus on the Aramaic Behistun papyrus as well as Ahiqar, both of which are found at Elephantine. But I would like to briefly show the complexities of the other literary texts that I guess we accidentally collaborated, that you spend most of your, also a lot of your time on as well, Dr. Holm. Okay. So with the exception of the Behistun papyrus, the literary texts of Achaemenid Egypt are unconcerned with the court settings of Persia or the Achaemenid world. Indeed, Sanders describes them and their topics as a eclectic assortment of narratives concerning powerful and interesting rulers and an Aramean courtier. The fact that the texts are found in Aramaic, of course, coalesces with Sanders, Holm, and other findings that Aramaic is, again, cosmopolitan, a cosmopolitan language lacking a visible or even permanent scribal culture. However, it is noteworthy that these same literary texts, for the most part, lack overt references to actual documents, Aramaic or otherwise. Aramaic used to write texts or transmit traditions because of its status as a cosmopolitan language does not necessarily overlap with literary representations of actual Aramaic or other material documents. So essentially, Aramaic as a cosmopolitan language that can be applied to any group or used to talk about any group doesn't mean those same texts actually talk about actual physical documents. I have put these up here because I didn't have as wonderful images as you do. The Sheikh Fadl inscription, TDD 23.1, is the earliest literary text of the Achaemenid Egypt and has been dated to sometime in the early to mid-5th century BCE. Included in the very fragmentary inscriptions are stories of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho and his interactions with a Nubian king. And in the document, the only reference or in the inscription, the only reference to a written document is found on the inscription's 16th panel, at least to my readings, after the text's main story. It reads, "Thus said the gods of Hora, peace to the scribe who wrote this writing." using the root katav, meaning to write, for both the verb and the cognate accusative, essentially, form. And this seems to function as a sort of colophon in Holmes' reading. I see here, therefore, not a literary reference to an act of writing, but a sign-off, signature, or blessing on the work of the inscription, rather than a literary reference to an actual document. The very fragmentary papyrus containing an Egyptian court tale of a certain Bar Pnesh is also found at Elephantine, TEDC 1.2. The extant text does not include any references to material texts, but instead relies on oral exchanges between Bar Pnesh and the Egyptian pharaoh, including blessings and curses. So I basically have nothing, but I'm unwilling to bet that there's nothing there as well. The last, and I would say one of the more difficult texts, is Papyrus Amher 63, pictured here, which is an Aramaic text written in Demotic script. To my knowledge, and relying on the work of others in their interpretation and normalization of the Demotic script into Aramaic, I find two brief references to material documents. The first in column 1, which specifies the writing of liturgy related to the New Year festival, and again in column 18, which briefly mentions a letter sent via emissaries of Sarmuga from Babylon to Nineveh. Now, it is difficult to ascertain the exact background or function of these references to material documents. Are they reminiscent of a Mesopotamian background or other early sources? In my current reading, I see no indication that the material texts mentioned in Papyrus Amher 63, at least based on the terminology that they use, imagine a specifically Persian context or a document type associated predominantly with the Achaemenid period. But I would, again, defer to the person who knows best in this room on the topic. The most prominent Aramaic literary text of Achaemenid Egypt, in my view, is the fragmentary Ahiqar, TEDC 1.1. It is composed of two major parts: a collection of wise sayings attributed to Ahiqar, and the story of Ahiqar's travails in the Neo-Assyrian courts of Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. In the court tale, Ahiqar is betrayed by his nephew, fakes his own death, but is eventually able to regain his status in court because of the depth of his wisdom and, frankly, his manipulation of hiding and revealing at the right time. The only overt references to documents or writing come from descriptions of Ahiqar's specific role as the court scribe or safar. Multiple times, Ahiqar is described as a wise and skillful scribe. He is the bearer of the seal of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and the counselor of all Assyria, upon whom the whole of Assyria relies. Now, I read these descriptions not so much as literary representations of texts or documentary forms, but as a characterization of Ahiqar's overall status or official role, or what he's meant to do. And I think this I'll come back to this. Ahiqar is meant to, as a scribe, do texts. There's supposed to be texts, but this doesn't actually happen in Ahiqar itself. So notably, and unlike court tales of the Hebrew Bible, Rosette stood up like that, such as the tales of Daniel, Esther, and Ezra, the plot of Ahiqar's demise and later rise in the court do not rely on any sort of documentation or royal order. Instead, the plot relies on oral reports or secret plots and discussions behind closed doors. It's actually quite surprising that material documents are lacking in the narrative, especially as a mode of communication by officials in the royal court with a character actively called scribe. Although it is difficult to exactly place the story of Ahiqar in a specific compositional setting, I am particularly convinced by the work of Bob Becking, Gard Granarod, and Christine Mitchell that Ahiqar, as well as the Aramaic Behistun papyrus, were important documents for scribal training and the transmission of Achaemenid imperial ideology at Elephantine. Following Becking, but going a step further, Seth Bledsoe, who is also here, emphasizes the late 5th century BC Elephantine setting for our understanding of the Ahiqar document and the complex negotiations of loyalty and obedience and their opposites, disloyalty and disobedience, necessary for some communities to survive before the king. As part of the larger narrative structure, the king commands for Nabusumisku and Ahiqar to be killed. But these commands are proved incorrect and actively reversed. Indeed, the king in his words, right, in his commands, is, to use one of Letzo's words, is fickle. He's also dangerous. He flies off the handle, ordering the execution of his most trusted official based only on the damaging words of a nephew who's actively betrayed him. This is in line 44. Letzo, in my view, is right in his argument that the story, quote, emphasizes the finality and unquestionable nature of the king's decree, while also depicting the king issuing such decrees in a capricious, almost whimsical manner, end quote. However, I must ask, can we call what the king does a decree? Of course, we are dealing with a fragmentary text, so I cannot with certainty eliminate the possibility of an actual royal decree with a proper specific term for it. But the lack of actual documents or pronouncements in the story of Ahiqar suggests to me that we are again dealing predominantly with oral communication and not official documents. However artificial this distinction may be as a modern standard for ancient Near Eastern documents. The king's words, mouth, and tongue are seemingly temporary. They can and do, thankfully for Ahiqar, waffle. The story's emphasis on the relative unreliability and danger of oral communication, both to a king and by a king, underscore in my reading the lack of actual documents of communication in the story. Documents which one would expect in a Persian court tale, even if it's set in the Neo-Assyrian period. Furthermore, the repeated emphasis of Ahiqar's role as scribe, counselor, and holder of the seals may serve as a cautionary tale of what happens when a king does not utilize the imperial bureaucracy, documentary bureaucracy, evidenced throughout the actual Achaemenid Aramaic documentary corpus. Without a more complete version of the Aramaic version of Ahiqar, however, it is difficult to say with certainty whether documents were entirely absent from the story. However, more than the other literary documents thus far discussed, the absence of documents in the extant Ahiqar textual form is certainly striking. It is also worth noting that the Ahiqar papyrus itself is a palimpsest. Yardeni reconstructs a customs account dating to the first quarter of the 5th century, which was erased before the papyrus was reused for the version of Ahiqar. So it's, again, possibly pointing to its use in the scribal curriculum, but literally, in order to write Ahiqar down, they had to erase a physical form of a documentary text to do it. So the fact that there's no text in a text about a scribe is, I think, quite telling. So I'll now turn to the final literary text of Elephantine, an Aramaic copy of Darius's Behistun inscription, TDC 2.1, telling of Darius's rise to the throne in 522 BCE. The translation methods and sources of the Aramaic papyrus have already been extensively studied by Sims-Williams, Christine Mitchell, and others. So I'm not going to rehash too much of it here. The Aramaic form of the Behistun is closest to the monumental inscription from Babylon, but as others have already recognized, it includes an insertion at its end from Darius's tomb inscription from Naqshi Rustam, which appears to be translated from the Old Persian. Now, unlike the Old Persian and Elamite forms of the actual trilingual Behistun inscription, the Aramaic and Babylonian forms do not have any references to documents. This is especially noticeable in the fact that it lacks paragraph 70 found in the Old Persian, and I'm grateful to my colleague Professor Rahim Shaigan for providing a translation of a language I do not know. The Old Persian, paragraph 70 here, calls for the dissemination of the inscription throughout the empire. Said Darius the king, by the greatness of Ahura Mazda, this transcript or copy that I reproduced or replicated was captured in Aryan, as well as on clay and on parchment. I also replicated thereupon my signature and reproduced my genealogy. It was both written and read in my presence. Afterward, this transcription or copy I sent out everywhere in the lands where the people in arms were applying themselves in my service. Now, without paragraph 70, there are no explicit references to Persian document types in the Aramaic translation, other than the papyrus itself. The material documents of the Achaemenid Empire, again, within the narratives, seem to go largely, not just unsaid, but like glossed over. But especially here, and I think in Ahiqar, their importance still looms large. And documentary texts or types are not actually completely absent from the physical papyrus of the Aramaic Behistun itself. Christine Mitchell importantly notes the presence of other texts on the papyrus, TDC 3.13, which Dr. Ma mentioned when we began today, specifically uses technical terms for different types of documents, memorandum or memoranda, a zokran, in multiple stages immediately after the Aramaic texts of the Behistun. Now, the memorandum is a document type found elsewhere in the Achaemenid corpus, including in the Yedeniah archive. For Mitchell, the accumulation of the memoranda on the same papyrus, again written after the Behistun text is already on the papyrus, suggests that it was not just reused, but she calls it an active text. And with each additional memorandum added to that text, she sees the scribes of Elephantine participating in the documentary practices of the Achaemenid Empire. So Aramaic texts are not present in the story, in the literary story, but they're on the document itself. So although the Aramaic translation does not specifically reference the dissemination of the Behistun text throughout the empire, it in and of itself reflects such documentation and the continued scribal practices associated with it. Like the Ahiqar palimpsest, Achaemenid documentary texts are part of the same material object. They might not be part of the story explicitly, but they are certainly present, or to return to the metaphor of my talk, visible. We just have to look for them. Now, I've tried to spend most of my time today not talking about the Hebrew Bible, because that's the next panel. But the most prevalent forms of the visual representations of actual texts, Achaemenid texts, are actually in the text of the Hebrew Bible. They're certainly visible in the biblical books of Ezra, Daniel, and Esther. The book of Ezra includes numerous literary documents from the Persian period, some of which are actually maintained in Aramaic. The documents include a letter of the Sumerians to King Artaxerxes, and the king's reply, a letter from the satrap Tadnai to King Darius is found in chapter 5 of Ezra, inquiring about the Edict of Cyrus. Darius' reply and a copy of the Edict of Cyrus are then found. And then finally in chapter 7 is a letter from King Artaxerxes to Ezra himself. Now, prominent Achaemenid documentary terms that I mentioned as my positive controls towards the beginning of my talk, like the nishtewan, are explicitly described as Aramaic in Ezra 4:7, how I opened my talk today. And in the very next verse, Ezra 4:8, the language actually switches to Aramaic, and the literary letter, here termed iggrah, a different type of document type, begins. The word ta'im, another technical document type or subtype, is used 21 times alone in the book of Ezra, and most often refers to the order of the king of Persia. However, in chapter 7, verse 23, it is the God of heaven that reigns over and extends ta'am or ta'im. As Christopher Jones has argued, the authors of Ezra take up a sort of epistolary memory of the Achaemenid Empire and their own experiences with Achaemenid texts, and in Ezra 7 Artaxerxes rescript, they place the ideology of the book of Ezra in the mouths, and I would change his wording here if I could, and in the documents of Persian kings and the official documents of them. Imperial domination is Yahweh or God's will, and God's means of providing for a restored Israel is through an Achaemenid document type. The book of Esther, specifically chapter 9, as well as the book of Nehemiah, although both written in Hebrew, similarly refer to specific documents of the Achaemenid period, likely as some form of authentication for their own message. And Esther 1, chapter 1, verse 22 also speaks of the dissemination of Achaemenid documents in every language and script, possibly reflecting processes described in the Behistun inscription. Even the book of Daniel, the biblical text most often cited in arguments about the universality or the cosmopolitan status of Aramaic and its application to multiple ancient Near Eastern empires. The book of Daniel contains the most references to Achaemenid forms, like Ta'im, in its chapter containing the story of Darius the Mede. There is a cosmopolitan, more universal outlook on the application of these documents, and it especially happens the later a text is. But there's still an association of Achaemenid Empire with Achaemenid documents, whether or not they knew what this exactly was what they're doing in terms of the old Persian loanwords. The Achaemenids and their documents in the biblical corpus are thus by no means invisible. Rather, it was their actual physicality, association with the Achaemenid Empire, and the widespread influence of Aramaic documents and language that make them all the more effective in their literary representations of the goals of their authors. Now, Sanders and others' emphasis on the cosmopolitan nature of Aramaic and the invisibility of Achaemenid scribal culture, or Aramaic scribal culture, is a compelling explanation for the widespread utility of Aramaic for stories about Assyrians, Egyptians, Babylonians, or Persians, and its continued life well into the Roman and even modern day. However, we must not forget about the actual materiality of documents in the literary sources of the Achaemenid and Hellenistic periods. Aramaic's original scribal culture of the Arameans may be invisible by the Persian period, but its Achaemenid context and overall meaning is largely visible in the epistolary memories of the next few centuries. Thank you.